Hello, I'm Richard Esplin with Alfresco, and this is episode 84 of Tech Talk Live. And this month we're going to talk about CMIS, the Content Management Interoperability Services Standard. CMIS is an important industry standard for doing content management. I think it's an important tool in every enterprise developer's tool belt. And we're joined today by Martin Bergljung, who will be presenting. He's our new, well, why don't you describe your new role, Martin?
Yeah, it's actually part of the presentation. So when I kick it off, I'll talk a little bit about who I am and what I'm doing and stuff.
Excellent. So the one announcement: our next event is April 17th. We're going to have our global virtual hackathon. It's going to take some preparation, so we're just going to focus on that. In the wiki, there's a page called Hackathon in the Alfresco wiki, and that has all the information about how you can join. You can join from home, hang out in the chat channel and Google Hangouts with us, and work on a project. There's projects and teams and things like that in the wiki. So I hope you'll sign up and participate with us on April 17th in whatever time zone you are. Last year I joined starting in Sydney, and I hung out all the way to LA, the end of the business day in LA. I don't know if I have that kind of stamina this year, but we'll see how long I can stay awake. You plan on joining us, Martin?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Just need to come up with some cool stuff to be hacking on.
Yeah, we've got a list of ideas in the wiki. So you know, obviously more ideas are helpful, but if somebody doesn't have an idea, go to the wiki and look over and join somebody's team. So excellent. So Martin recently wrote a book on CMIS. You're a good person to be presenting on this topic. Last time we did CMIS was probably a year and a half ago, and it's one of those core skills as a enterprise content management developer. So we think it's important to cover it again today. So Martin, how would you like to introduce your topic?
Yeah, so I will just switch over to my presentation immediately here. Let's see, screen share. So can you see my screen now, yeah?
Yep, looks good with the vintage Alfresco slide deck.
Yeah, it's a real relax presentation. All right, so let me just quickly go through who I am. So my name is Martin Bergljung. I just joined Alfresco about 2 weeks ago, and I am going to be working on the developer ecosystem, so that's something new we've been setting up. So I'll be looking at the software development kit, the samples, and the API, and doing loads of outbound events like this one. So before I joined Alfresco, I worked for system integrators for 7 years. So I'm bringing in a lot of kind of experience from the outside to inside Alfresco, so hopefully I can impact the software development kit in a good way. I've written 2 books about Alfresco. I've presented at 4 different DevCons, and I did one Tech Talk Live about Alfresco and Solar a while ago. So that's my background. Now, so what are we going to talk about today? So we're going to talk first a little bit about what is CMIS for you guys that are completely new to it. I will do kind of a one-on-one session for a couple of slides. Then we'll focus on CMIS 1.1. So that's the focus of this presentation. So we will look through how you can actually get and interact with content in the repository via something called a browser binding, which is focusing, as the name says, on the browser and JavaScript and HTML forms, etc. So we will go through most of the common operations you might want to do when you start out. And in the end, we will also look at JavaScript widgets, how you can actually inject JSON responses from a request directly into a jQuery widget. So quite a bit to cover, but a lot of fun. So just to read.
Really quick, Martin, I wanted to interject that if anybody has any comments or questions, put them into the chat channel at chat.alfresco.com. and I'll see that and be able to interrupt and ask the question to Martin. So anybody who's watching the broadcast, it's chat.alfresco.com.
Good. All right. So as Richard said, so CMIS stands for Content Management Interoperability Standard. So by just reading the name, what it means, you can see interoperability. So that's what it is all about. It's a standard for interoperability between different content management systems. So what you get with CMIS is a service API first and most, the standard API for talking to content management system that supports CMIS. On top of that, if you know a little bit of SQL, you can also quite easily query the system because it supports a subset of SQL 92. So that's another thing that they try to think about when they define the CMIS spec, that let's not just invent new stuff, try and use something that's already there that people know. CMIS also comes with domain and object models, so there are some new concepts and some new names for types and things that you need to be getting acquainted to. There are different protocol bindings, they call it. It means you can talk via, for example, SOAP or via REST. We'll be focusing on REST. And current version of CMIS is 1.1, which we'll be focusing on. All this is managed by Oasis, which is a standards organization. Service API. So quickly run through here so you know what's available. So different kind of service groups. So if you look up in the left corner, you have repository services. So you can get information as soon as you start working with CMIS. You're going to want to contact the repository, get information about what kinds of stuff it supports, because according to the standard, you don't have to support everything immediately, and you can get an idea of what your specific version of your CMS server, what it supports, by doing get repository info, for example. That first section also gives you the possibility to discover what content models are installed in your repository. So that's, for example, get type, etc. Those calls. So you can then, while you know what your repository supports, you can start navigating in it. So you can, for example, do get children, which will list your folders and documents, etc. You have object services, which is basically manipulation of a content item like a file or a folder in the repository. Supports versioning, so that's all covered by the specification. Multi-filing, it's something you might not have heard of before. That's basically if you have a file, usually you upload it under one folder, but this multi-filing service also supports filing it under another folder. There will still be a primary folder where it's filed, but kind of a link to another folder also for a file. Discovery services, that's where you do your searching. So we're going to see how you can do a query on the repository. Relationships, you can set up different relationships from a source file to a target file, like this file was derived from this, or this file is a copy of this, etc. Policy, that's not what you might think, that has loads of policies that comes with a spec. No, it's kind of a concept. So you can apply a kind of a description of a policy to a node, but you need to implement the actual logic that sits behind that policy. ACL access control list is supported, so you can set up for each node or each object, you can set up different permissions for that node. Now, for CMIS 1.1, there is a couple of new things that are interesting. So first is create, update, delete type. So that is type mutability that's been built into the spec, meaning, let's say you have a new application you built, a healthcare application that should talk to a repository, and it needs its own domain model for healthcare. if your repository supports this create, update, delete type, it could inject that content model dynamically while the repository is running. So that's kind of a cool feature. It could be used in the future by design tools and other things. So it's quite an interesting couple of new operations. Create item, that's a new type. So if you have CMIS 1.0, it supports 4 types: folder, document, relationship, and policy. CMIS 1.1 adds a 5th one called item, which can be used to model things like a group, a user, or something that doesn't fit into the other types. There is also append content stream, which is cool if you are if you are chunk, if you want to chunk upload a file. So if you have a 10 gig file and you want to upload it in chunks, you can do that with this. Also, you can update a whole bunch of properties at the same time. So a couple of quite interesting new features in CMIS 1.1.
Now, I want to highlight that in addition to CMIS being useful to do all your standard ECM stuff, is that service list showed, it's also the basis for the Alfresco public API. So that provides your core ways to interact with an Alfresco repository, and then there's additional services that do the Alfresco specific stuff. Now, Martin, Suje asks if multi-filing is related to how Alfresco handles associations, or because Alfresco only allows content to be in one place at a time. How does CMIS multi-filing fit into the Alfresco model?
No, it's not the same as relationships or associations, if that's what he asked. Actually, you cannot from share. I don't think you can actually multi-file via share. You need to use this API via CMIS to multi-file. And then if you go into the Node browser, if you are familiar with that, you can see the item, how it looks like when it's multi-file. So it will basically have one primary path in the repo, and then it will also have a second kind of path for multi-file under another folder. That's as good as I can explain it. I don't think it's the same as relationships. Maybe some other Alfresco person can answer. I don't know.
Excellent, thanks.
Yeah, all right. So when I was talking about the query language, this is basically how you can use that. So you can select from where, like in the same way you can do for a database. So this particular query here actually shows you also that you are querying based on metadata, CMIS name, which matches CM name if you're familiar with Alfresco. And it also does a full text search via contains Olympics there. So you can combine metadata search and full text search in one go here in this example. Now, if we look at the domain model a bit more, these are some concepts that you need to be familiar with then. So as I mentioned, you have 4 different types: document, folder, relationship, policy. If you're looking at the document, it can have content. That's why it has content stream there. So basically it has bytes, and the document that represents the metadata, and it can be versionable. So if you're looking at the folder and document, the main difference is between those two, that documents can be versionable and have content stream bytes, basically. A folder, as you know in Alfresco, can't be versioned. And it can't have any content stream either. A document can also have a rendition, so basically like a thumbnail. So that's an extra thing there. Relationships is basically, as I said a little bit, you can have one file to be copied from or related to or derived from those kind of relationships. A policy is a text kind of information about a policy you want to apply to a specific document. But as I said, it's not actually enforcing that. You need to build the logic around it. If you have an object like a document or folder, it can have an access control list with so-called access control entries. So a file, a certain group or person can have certain permissions on that. Is direct is denoting if you inherited that access control entry. You know, in Alfresco, you have, if you create a new folder, it inherits all permissions from its parent and so on. Here you can see CMIS 1.1, which has a new item, as I talked about, and you could, for example, have some custom item type called group. And in CMIS 1.1, we have something called secondary types. An item in the repository can only have one primary type, like document, folder, relationship, and policy, but it can have multiple secondary type, which kind of maps to aspects in Alfresco. So you can have multiple secondary types and then one document type applied to an item, for example. So when we are querying the repository now, we will see all our aspects returned as secondary types.
And to do that before the CMIS 1.1 release in older versions of Alfresco 4.0 and 3.4, people would frequently use an add-on, a CMIS extension, as they're working with the repository. So is those add-ons is those extensions get upgraded, they can start doing it with native CMIS instead of having to use additional stuff. That's pretty cool.
Yeah. Right, so you might be wondering here, so you already saw a model like here. This is more a specific object type model. So you need to learn the new namespace CMIS : document, and you need to learn what different properties are called and so on, because you're going to use that when you query and when you read information from responses to requests. So here you can see all those different names of properties and types. Now, transport. So there are 3 different ways you can talk to CMIS repository. So you got web services via SOAPs. So that's a whole block of XML you need to send back and forth. Or you can use AtomPub and a REST-based approach with HTTP. Then you will be doing XML, or as we'll be talking about today a lot, you can use the so-called browser binding, which is HTTP plus JSON. So that fits nicely into JavaScript and browser-based applications. So now, what's the benefit of this CMIS? So it's language neutral. What I mean by that is that if you actually have, let's say you have an operating system, whatever it is, from a mainframe, mini computer, Linux, Windows, anything that can make an HTTP call and interpret or parse XML or JSON can actually talk to a CMS server that supports CMIS. So this is kind of a big thing. You don't need any specific super library or something to talk to it. As long as you can do HTTP calls and parse XML and JSON, you can talk to it. And that means platform independence also. You got a standard service API, so if you are coding against it, you're kind of future-proofing yourself a bit. And you also have the possibility to switch CMS server or talk to several different CMS servers in the same way. And when you're querying them, you're using something familiar like SQL. So lots of benefits. I'm sure there are loads more. But, right, so who is actually using it? So here I've just done some research to see how many different vendors are actually using it. So as you can see, it's widely adopted by all major players, even all the way into service-oriented architects like Mule and Spring Integration. They all provide support for CMIS with connectors or integrations. So when and why should you use it? When is, as you might have figured, integration. So that's lots of integration scenarios where you should be thinking CMIS if you are managing content between different systems, because you are then going to have a compliant standard integration. Also, something that will become more and more common is probably custom UI clients. So if you are building a new UI client because maybe it has requirements that differs a lot from what you get from Share, you should be thinking immediately CMIS as the API and protocols and so on that you would use in that client. So that's when why, as I just said, you want to have a standard way to manage your content. You don't want to start creating a UI client and create loads of proprietary web scripts and stuff just to discover later on that you actually need to talk to more CMS systems. So if you go to a bigger customer, they will have more than one CMS server guaranteed. So you need to think about that up front. Now, some common use cases here, probably you have seen already, maybe. Repository to repository. For example, in Drupal, it's often the case that you want to display a link to a PDF file or something. You then don't want to have to kind of duplicate that content from Alfresco to Drupal. You can then use Drupal modules, in specifically CMIS folder and CMIS file, which are two fields that you can start using your content types in Drupal. So that's one example. You can use Mule ESB CMIS connectors if you have an enterprise application that should talk to multiple CMIS servers or CMS servers. Then you can put Mule ESB, the broker, in the middle, and then your enterprise application wouldn't have to know all the details behind. And as I said, clients, new UI clients, whether it's mobile or desktop or other web clients, they should be using CMIS. Right. That was kind of
I think it's worth mentioning as well that like on your slide that mentioned libraries and the Apache chemistry, most developers aren't going to be calling the REST calls directly. They're going to be using one of those libraries from Apache chemistry or a CMIS binding in the language of your choice.
Yeah. So today we are specifically focusing on the browser side. There are libraries there also, but if you are in Java, PHP, Objective-C or whatever, or some other language, you should be .NET. You should be looking at Apache chemistry because there are most certainly libraries like OpenCMIS that you should be using. Right. So just to recap the CMIS 1.1 standard. So we have type mutability, as I said, so you can inject new content models dynamically, which is a super big thing. Secondary object types, so this means aspects in the Alfresco world, so you can manipulate them in a standard way now with CMIS 1.1. Browser binding, let's see next slide a little bit more about that. Bulk updates, which is important. And the new item, CMIS :item object type, which you can use to model things that doesn't fit into the other types. And also you can move large files into the repo in a better way. Now, the browser binding, what does it mean? It's based on JSON for transporting your data. So it then uses HTTP GET to read content basically back as if it's metadata JSON or the bytes of the content, or POST to create, update, or delete, or do all kinds of other stuff, setting up a relationship. It covers the entire specification. For example, if you are using AtomPub, there is certain things like create content from source, or I don't remember exact name of that operation, but there are some operations that are not supported that browser binding supports. Authentication, all CMIS servers should support HTTP basic auth. If you are using a browser client, there is something called token authentication that's recommended. It's not actually implemented very much yet, so it's difficult to use it, but you should know it's there. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's going to be more compact, easy to use, and more performant than the other XML-based bindings because they are more kind of verbose than JSON. So this is very much suitable for mobile applications where you have a requirement to save on the bandwidth that you're using. There's no extra client libraries that you need. You can just start using it. So the repository, when we start using it, it will respond with JSON or the binary bytes of files if we are directly accessing them. So we're going to use URL parameters and HTML forms to actually communicate, which might be new, specifically HTML forms. You will see lots of examples of that. If you are uploading a file with metadata, you can do that in one go now. So you will have a multi-part encoded upload with metadata plus the content bytes. If you have used AtomPub, you might know that you first create your metadata, and then you, from that, you get a link to where you should put your content. So AtomPub in general is a bit more communication you need to do, so it's not as efficient. And HTML forms are used to do all kinds of stuff, as we'll see. So why, you might be asking more than I just said, why did this browser binding come about? So as soon as CMIS 1 was released, there was a lot of work going on, desktop apps being creating, mobiles, web applications, so forth. But there was a bit of a problem as soon as you came into the JavaScript area. So basically, if you are looking specifically at different bindings like web service, its XML is very bloated and it's difficult to manage that in JavaScript, specifically as we'll see also with the AtomPub when you manage namespaces. It's not so easy. And links for navigation with AtomPub, as I said, if you wanted to navigate the folder hierarchy, you would navigate to one folder and you will look in the XML for an up or down link URL, and then you will move on. That's not very efficient if you actually want to quickly navigate in the hierarchy. Now, so what you need to start using the browser binding, you'd actually need an endpoint or an entry point, if you like. And this is vendor specific. So this is how it looks like for the browser binding. And for example, on my local, I have an Alfresco 50C here community running. I would be using this localhost 88 Alfresco API default public CMIS version 1.1 browser. That's the entry point to start using the browser binding when you talk to an Alfresco local installation. If you are talking to the cloud or some other Alfresco installation, that's going to be a different URL. Now, a bit about authentication again. It's probably going to come questions around this, but this is getting started here, so I'm not going to dig into it too much. But HTTP basic auth is something that needs to be supported by the server, so you can be sure it supports that. You can use tickets. You can, if you're familiar with Alfresco, you can call the Service API login. You should do that with HTTPS, obviously, because you don't want to send your password in plain text. You will then get back a ticket that you can send on subsequent request. Now, the browser binding defines something called token-based authentication, and that's in the spec defined as a CMS server should supply a script file, a JavaScript file that you can include in your HTML page, and it should have functions like CMIS login. Now, I don't know of any service that supports that now, so we're going to have to fall back on HTTP basic auth for these quick demos that I'm doing here. In the end, I'm going to talk about some JavaScript libraries that are used by our SharePoint integration and Office integration stuff, I think, and it's available on Apache Chemistry for download, where you can get more information about how to do that. Right, but let's keep going here with our getting started stuff. So the first,
a couple quick questions though. So one question is about performance. How performant is the atom pub binding versus the is the browser binding versus the atom pub binding or the SOAP bindings? Does it perform much better? And how can people code to improve efficiency of their CMIS calls?
Do you mean if they are using atom pub right now, how can they make it more efficient?
Yes, and moving to the browser binding, that'll improve the number of calls they can do in a specific period of time?
Yeah, as you heard, I've given several examples for atom pub binding requires you to manage more data because the XML is more verbose than JSON. It also requires you to do more calls. I gave you a couple of examples for example, when you upload a file with atom pub, you might need to do 2 calls for meta and content. Some of this stuff is baked together in Open CMIS. Other things are the navigation. So if you are navigation in the folder hierarchy, you're going to have to use these links up and down in the XML and kind of fish them out to start navigating. So, and if you look at the JSON, if you look at the data, just use your browser and Firebug or something to see how much data is transferred when you use JSON compared to atom pub. You'll see it's much less. Also, when you use JSON, we'll see examples of that. I haven't showed that yet, but there is something called succinct. Don't know how to pronounce it, but that means that you can say to the server, I'm actually interested in getting back the response in a small, compact format. I'll show you that later. Instead of succinct. I'll show you what I mean there so you can see how you can make it more compact. Is that enough answer?
And there was also a couple of questions about CMIS, moving from CMIS 1.0 to 1.1, and do people have to upgrade to the 1.1 API? And I think, as you mentioned, the endpoint has the version number of the protocol you're going to use in it. Mm-hmm. So as long Alfresco is going to support the 1.0 API for the foreseeable future. We'll announce before we have to drop that. So if you have written 1.0 specific code, you can just keep using that endpoint and make no changes. You don't have to use 1.1. But for those who want to upgrade, Martin, who want to adapt their code from 1.0 to 1.1, are changes necessary, or is it just that if you want to use the new stuff, you use the new stuff, and if you don't need to, then your code still works as is?
I mean, if you are using, let's say you have built something that uses you don't use Open CMIS, but you use it directly, like atom pub, so you are using HTTP and you're parsing XML. If you do that, obviously going to be a massive change because you haven't abstracted how you deal with data. So if you had, let's say you are querying the repository for a list, top folder list, you get that back in XML and start parsing and stuff in your client. If you're going to switch that to the browser binding, you're going to have to recode a lot because it will return JSON instead of XML. So if you are in Java and you've used OpenCMIS, you have an abstraction layer between you and the CMIS standard, so you are not going to be that affected by that because you are using a Java API instead of raw HTTP and XML. Does it make any sense what I'm saying?
Yeah. How big the upgrade is will be depends on the format you use to write it. But it sounds like, so it sounds like it's very, very application specific. One question from an anonymous chat client user is the, which do you recommend to use, Open CMIS library or the browser binding? And I think that question sounds a lot like, what's your favorite programming language? It depends on your use case.
Let's continue with the presentation, and we can see where the browser binding fits in and where you might want to use Open CMIS. Open CMIS, I would imagine you do on a server-side integration level, or if you are building a web application that's based on a Java-based UI development framework.
So there are also in the chemistry project, some of the client libraries there can allow you to pick between AtomPub and JSON as well. So you can do the JSON binding on the server side if your client library supports it, but like Martin said, it's a lot more convenient when you're on the client side.
Right. Let's move on, and I think it'll become a bit clearer in the coming examples.
Sounds great.
All right. So the first bit here is just basically to get information. This is the entry endpoint URL. That URL usually gives you back the repository information that you want to have a look at to see what's your repository identifier that you want to use. What's the product you are using? What are the capabilities? So you know if you're going to do some operations up front, if they are supported or not, you can then check that before you allow the user to do something. So the repository ID, actually you might be asking, why is that needed? Isn't it just one repository? That's it. But you can actually have a server that supported multiple repositories with different capabilities and things. So when it comes to Alfresco, here you just have the default repository identifier. Previously that was a UUID, so you had to figure that one out before you can continue, but now it's easier. You don't have the UUID for the repo ID in every call, as we'll see. If you go to the end of this JSON response, you will see also important stuff like version supported. Change is incomplete means if you look at the change log. So CMIS defines a change log, that you should be able to access a change log. So what has happened in the repo? If change is incomplete is true, that means that this repo does not give you a full from time 0 to now change log. It doesn't include that. Changes on type, so you can see, okay, the change log is just going to continue stuff happening to documents and folders, not, for example, relationships or items or policies. You can see what Alfresco defines as anonymous user and group everyone and things like that. The two last URLs are important because that's the URLs you're going to use going forward. So you have repository URL that's usually used for things like things that doesn't require you to be on a specific folder. Like you want to get the types that your repo supports, then you're going to use that URL. Root folder URL is for most of the operations you're going to do because they're related to a specific folder usually. Right, so let me just show you this, how it looks like in real time. So if I go to my browser here and types, and I'm going to get back repository information here. So what you want to start doing here is actually install some JSON in Chrome. So you want to go and get this.
Are you in Chrome or Firefox?
Chrome.
Oh, I see.
So when you actually look at it, it's going to be more interesting. Let's see if that works now, or if I... Yeah, right, so that worked. So you can see when you do that, you get a better view of your JSON responses, which is important. So you can see here already, you don't need much tooling and stuff to start working with it. So as we saw, you get the capabilities, and you also get information about all the different proprietary permissions that Alfresco supports here. You can see familiar stuff like coordinator, collaborator. This basically match the permission definitions, XML stuff. And at the end here, you're going to get 3 permissions that are mandatory by the CMIS spec, CMIS read, write, all. And then you can see mapping between the proprietary permission and the CMIS permission here. And that's basically the extra stuff that I didn't have in the slide. So if I move back to slide now, let's move on. So the next topic is, so you got your repository information, you know what your repository supports, you know what URLs to use. You then can start getting content, and you can do that in 2 ways, by path or by ID. I like specifically here you can do it by path, because you can actually use a display path and just type straight into the URL field where you want to have a look. So if I jump straight to examples, I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. First, just listing the top root folder, basically company home, then data dictionary. Then I'm going to show you a couple of parameters you can send with this request, like maximum items you want back, filter to get a bit less properties back per item. Then show you this succinct attribute, what that makes, and then show you how to retrieve a content item that's not a folder. So let's do a couple of examples here, show you how this thing works. So here I can see I'm getting back the root folder, that's company home basically. So how do I know that? Because I'm familiar with data dictionary. You can see it's quite verbose here, so this is what you get if you don't specify anything. You're going to get all these CMIS property names from the object model that I was talking about in the beginning. You're going to see secondary object type IDs, so these are familiar stuff for folders if you work with Alfresco. So you're probably asking, what's the P? Okay, so historically, aspects were modeled as policy types before the secondary thing was available. So P in front of a custom aspects means it's actually modeled as a policy. You will see later on D colon and F colon and R colon, that means document, custom document type, custom folder type, custom relationship type in Alfresco. Right, so let's do some other examples. So if I want to go to another specific folder, I'm basically just typing the folder display path of the root, which represents company home. And that's how it goes. So if I want to just not have all these properties here, all the returned, I can filter. So let's just get back 10 items and just name. So you immediately say, you got back loads more properties. True. But if you look in the spec, these properties, object type ID, object ID, base type ID are required. You can't turn them off like this by filtering. They're going to be returned anyway. So object type ID, that gives you the CMIS folder type. And so if you look at the name, space templates, that's just a straightforward CMIS folder. base type CMIS folder. If you had different, if this was some other custom folder type that you created, then the object type would be that type and base type would be CMIS folder. So you can get those two things from a request like this. Now let's see this succinct that we've been talking about. So now you can see some interesting stuff here. So now I suddenly got all the properties in one kind of object here. And this is important because if you're going to feed this into a JavaScript widget, it's quite interesting to get them back like this instead of as one property per objects. So this is some new interesting stuff. Okay, what's gonna happen if I actually go for a file instead? All right, so now you can see it didn't return what we might have thought. It did not return the metadata. It returned the content. So if you are querying a folder, the so-called CMIS selector defaults to metadata. And if you are querying a file, content item, the CMIS selector defaults to returning the content. So how can I return the metadata for this file? I can add this argument here, the CMIS selector, to object. It will then switch to returning the metadata for it. If I want it succinct, I can just add that at the end here. Equals true, and then I should get it back like that. So that gives you kind of an idea how you can work with path. So it's quite powerful directly from the browser. Now, if you have queried and you have a lot of information, you have object identifiers. So you have IDs for your objects. And if you don't want to go via path and stuff, you can go directly via an object ID like this. So you're going to go for the base URL, root folder URL, and then you have an argument object ID and then the UUID. So this has changed in later versions of CMIS. It no longer looks like node references. So the workspace spaces store stuff in front of it is gone. It's just a universally unique identifier, 128-bit or something. That's now the ID. So that's what you're going to use instead. So let's see if this ID is there actually. So this ID actually matches an email template in the data dictionary. It actually matches that one that I was querying before. This one here, new user email. I found out the object ID, and how did I do that? I actually went to the repo here, went into the data dictionary, email templates, invite, and I was looking at the default one here, probably this one or something. And object ID in CMIS is the same thing as going back here and grabbing this. This is the object ID, the same thing. So that's how you can play around with that if you want.
It's the NodeRef.
Yeah, but excluding the workspace spaces store stuff.
Yeah, but the and that's really useful to, that's an artifact of Alfresco, but the standard doesn't. I was told that the standard doesn't. You can't trust that the NodeRef is going to be immutable between calls. You should still look it up. Look up the object ID through the spec. or through the API before you use it, just to be sure that nothing's changed, like a version increase or something along those lines.
If you looked at, maybe you saw in some JSON responses, you had a proprietary property, alf NodeRef, that you can get from your JSON responses also. Right, so you now played
There's
around
a
with it.
quick question about how do you reference an object in a different content store?
Good question. Let's think about that. So basically, when we are accessing now, we are only getting access to, actually, I don't know. If we can only get to the standard live content, I don't know if you can get to the archive store here quickly.
Yeah, that's a fair answer. AON asks because we're unsure about whether the node refs are unique across all content stores, and I think that's part of the problem of it can be a useful shortcut for testing to know that the node ref is the CMIS object ID, but when I'm coding, I think best practice is to always look up the object ID through the API before you use it, just because there's intricacies that I don't exactly understand.
Yeah, good point. So you in your JSON response, if you return all properties for an object, you have both object ID and you also have the internal alf NodeRef. But maybe something we should look up, that how would you access something in the archive store? So all right, so to get to content models, we use another CMIS selector. I was talking about those. You select type children. So type children is going to give you the possibility to navigate the content model hierarchy. So basically, you start with, this is the repository URL, so you don't need a /root anymore. You just /browser and then semi-selector type children. That gives you back the top level, basically the base types, CMIS folder, document, and so on. If you then want to see what types that extend CMIS document, for example, you will add an attribute type ID. So say, I want to start listing types from CMIS documents and so forth. If you are referring to type ID that's a custom type, so it's specific to Alfresco, then you would have to prefix those with F for folders and D for documents and R for relationships and P for policies. So let's do a couple of examples how that might look like.
Let's do a quick time check. How many examples do you have left? We have about 5 minutes.
Right, I have truckloads. It's actually almost like we have 2 sessions in one.
Yeah, and we can do a follow-up session. It'd be worthwhile, I think. So we do have time for another question or two from the RSC channel if anybody has any. I think we're caught up there. And there were a couple questions on the Google Plus page we might have to come back to after the session and answer on the page. But I wanted to spend a few minutes and talk about the best resources for people to learn more about CMIS. So of course, what was the title of your book? It's through Packt?
Yeah, Alfresco CMIS, and then you have the other one from Manning, right? Apache Chemistry, yeah, which is more detailed.
So those are great resources. There is a lot of API documentation at docs.alfresco.com. And there's the other CMIS sessions we've done on Tech Talk Live. You can see those in the Alfresco wiki under live. They're from 2013, so it's good we're revisiting the topic. And I guess we're going to have you on probably over the summer to go into more details on examples on CMIS. Is there? We also, Ahmed is saying how great this presentation is, so thanks for sharing, Martin. Is there any other useful resources? Oh, of course, the chemistry project at apache.org. That's where you get a lot of bindings and the reference implementations of Alfresco, including the CMIS workbench, which is a great tool for learning how things work. Trying to think if is there any other resources you'd recommend, Martin?
Yeah, I had a few things in the end, but we kind of just scratched the surface so far. So there's loads of stuff that you need to get up to get started with this. There's quite a few more things actually.
Yeah. So what's I guess we have time for 2 more examples.
Yeah, let's get through this. So this gives you an idea of the listing types. Let's get into the forms a bit. So to create folders, you would just use a standard form and specify an action. So you use control field here, control fields, input fields. So you specify what actions you want to do, create folder in this case. You specify the properties you want to set, basically metadata, and then a submit. So here I'm submitting actually to the root. So I want to create this folder under the company home folder. So if I just do that one, see if I can open that in Chrome. Like, okay, so here I can just via this create a folder and it returns the new object properties for that folder. So let's see if I have share. That folder was called project, so it's now a new folder here. So if I move on, I can do the same thing for create document. I just add change the action and put in a new field, content for type, and here I can choose a file. Let's see where I have that. I'm going to upload this project list file here. And it also returns the new object information so you can keep going where you are. And if I did correct, it should be under projects because I used here /root /projects. So that's how you tell it where you want it. And aspects, I can show you how to add an aspect. So here you do an update. That's basically the same as doing an update. And then updating the secondary object types. What you need to do here is actually first finding out the aspects that your object has already, because you cannot set one by one. You need to take all that it already got and then add, in this case, effectivity. And that will then add that aspect. And here you can see how you set dates as milliseconds. I'm just going to continue and show you a bit more. Search. So this is how you do search. Search. I've created a bit of a... Here, I've just created an HTML form. I can search directly from that one. I'm getting results. I can say include allowable actions. It's going to include that per object. So this gives you an idea how you can start working with the browser binding in HTML forms. Here you can see the CMS action was query. And now a little bit about the JavaScript integration. So normally you create your HTML, you include a JavaScript, and here I have a get repo ID function that should just return the repository information and display the repositories there and version. And I do that with the standard XML HTTP request. That will not work. So if I do that, I'm going to get this, which is basically same origin policy problem. So what I would have to do is circumvent that in some way. What every repository has to support is something called JSON P. That's JSON padded inside a function. So that's something Alfresco supports. So you can add a callback, list repo info here, for example, and tell the repository whenever you return JSON, it should be wrapped in this JavaScript function. And then you can inject script in your page and say run this action and then display it that way. So basically what happens is that, let's see if I have time to run that example. JSON P here. Get repository ID. It's going to immediately return that information, and let's see if I can show you how that looks like.
And Andy's pointing out that the multi-filing creates that you can do multi-filing through the Java API, but not through the CMIS API. So you can create it with the Java API, but you have to read it using the CMIS API.
Yeah, all right.
But you can read it using the CMIS API. He also says that NodeRefs are unique for the repository in Alfresco, so that's convenient to know.
So here you can see what happened when I was running that. It injected this script here, and that returns the result wrapped in this list repo info. So it padded that, so it is considered not a different origin. What you don't want to do is try and manage these JSON P things by yourself, because you can imagine you have several buttons and stuff on a page, maybe a list of things. You want that handled and removed automatically. You can then use jQuery to do that. So with jQuery, you can use their Ajax functionality and tell it, I want to support JSON P here. So I'm just telling it, please use JSON P. I don't do anything special with the URL. It's just a standard and username, password, and telling it when it's successful, call this operation and just list it. And that will actually work without me having to do anything about JSON P and injecting scripts and stuff. Now, last thing I wanted to show you was feeding widgets. So let's say I have an HTML data table, a jQuery widget that should feed into a data table. I can then just update my HTML page a bit and include jQuery data tables and so forth, as style sheets and stuff, and a table where it should go, and still using the same Ajax call here. The list repo info is a bit updated. I've added list top folder children here, which will, from this here, get data from, this is what is responded, objects, object property. I can then, with this widget, point into that object property CMIS name value and extract the properties automatically from that. So this is where it starts to come to play, JSON and the browser binding. And then have that widget make the call. So I can try and do that live here just to show you how that works. So here is the get repository. So you actually can, with 1 hour's work, create something quite cool here with search and sorting and stuff. So it will actually do stuff interactively here. And this is actually just with this much JSON and this much JavaScript, sorry. And sorry, that was probably the wrong, this one, sorry. I just want to show you how much code it is. It's not much code actually to do that stuff. And let's see if I can just finish this off. Now, so you know now what you can do with the browser. So there is, just so you know, there is in the Apache Chemistry project, there is a CMIS JavaScript library that embeds and abstracts the CMIS API and supports cross-origins resource sharing. So basically, you can set headers with what sites you allow your client to touch. What you need to do is, however, enable CORS for Alfresco, which is not by default. I think there's a slide share presentation from another summit that tells you how to do that. Last thing, there are CMIS extensions. So basically, you have CMIS spec 1.1, but you also have extensions that are being worked on, and you can see them here at this URL. One extension that are being worked on is, for example, to have just one proprietary URL which gets back a JSON document with all the endpoints and authentication mechanisms and stuff. So that might be something that comes up in the future that makes that a bit easier for the clients. But that's it.
Excellent. So are you planning on, hopefully you can post your slide deck?
I will upload all the code and slides and everything. So
excellent.
You can play with it.
So I'll link to that from the YouTube videos notes and put it on the Google Plus event page. And thanks for your time. Very useful. And we should cover CMIS again. It's that standard tool. It's a standard tool in the toolkit. So everybody should understand it. Even as an administrator, it's very useful for being able to script going into the repository and doing maintenance tasks, things like that. So thank you for your time. So the next event is April 17th, the Virtual Global Hackathon. Come join us, work beside Martin, and be able to ask him questions about whatever your CMIS project is. Check the wiki.alfresco.com hackathon page for more information. You just join online. You don't have to go anywhere. So hopefully you can join us. So with that, we thank you for attending, and thanks again, Martin, for presenting, and thanks for all the audience questions. And we'll talk to you guys later.
Thanks. Bye.